Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Thank you very much to the OWASP Foundation and AppSec USA for having me along. Pleasure to be speaking to you all today, and looking forward to a quick and exciting session. My name is Casey Ellis. The talk today is on time for a change, why it's more important than ever to revisit the CFAA. Before we get into that, just a little bit of housekeeping. I am not a lawyer. The lawyers that have given input to the projects that I'll discuss here are not your lawyers. This is not legal advice, and no lawyers were harmed during the creation of this presentation. So, what we're going to be talking about is a fair bit of kind of content and material around the legal frameworks that exist around good faith security research. And what we've tried to do is create tools to make improvement in that area as easy as possible for everyone. But you should always seek your own legal advice. So, getting that part out of the way. All right, who is this guy? My name's Casey Ellis. I'm the founder, chairman, and CTO of Bugcrowd. I've been in information security for about 20 years. I've been, monkeying around with computers and hacking things my entire life, but started the career in InfoSec straight out of high school. My career arc is kind of interesting in that it started off, just intrigued and messing about with stuff. I turned that into a career in pen testing. And then moved across into the dark side, getting into solutions architecture and sales. At some point, that kind of back of house experience and the front of house experience got together and conspired. I got it in my head that I wanted to be an entrepreneur, and did that basically. Went off and did the startup thing. So, as a result of that, very, very proud to have pioneered the crowdsourced security as a service model. Starting Bugcrowd out in 2012. We're an American company. I'm actually usually based in San Francisco. I'm actually in Sydney, Australia, as we record this, hiding out from COVID, but normally based in San Francisco. But started the company from here, moved across to SF in 2012, launched our first programs in 2012. So, having broken ground in the space, at that time, it was an incredibly novel concept, but, today, 8 years later, as we talk about it, it's something that's far more broadly accepted. I'm an Aussie, I'm a husband and father of two, and as I mentioned, I'm based in San Francisco normally when it's not unprecedented times, as it were. So just quickly, what is Bugcrowd? Really, the genesis of the idea was out of running a pen testing company, a combination of running a pen testing company and seeing the need for human creativity to be applied to cybersecurity problems. Like when you think about what we're trying to do, it's a creative problem set, software development, software creation, the deployment of systems, that all involves human creativity. It's not a technology problem at its root. The technology just makes it go faster and makes it more impactful. When you think about the adversary, they're creative as well. So really the idea behind Bugcrowd was this idea So the concept behind Bugcrowd was really, how do we take the latent creativity and the latent potential that exists in the white hat hacker community from all around the world, and actually plug it into where the problems exist and where questions need to be answered in the cybersecurity market right across the board. The whole idea that kind of got it going was seeing bug bounty programs, the likes of Netscape and Google and Facebook, kind of making that concept popular at the time, or at least making it kind of a thought about idea and something that people are starting to consider. Really what we've worked on ever since is this idea of not just facilitating vulnerability disclosure and bug bounty programs, but really like plugging every available person who wants to do this type of work into the problems that are available for them to actually connect to, solve, and then obviously earn money and earn a living from. So that's what we do as an organization. Bug bounty programs, as you would know them, in terms of public programs, crowdsourced penetration testing, attack surface management, and vulnerability disclosure programs. And that fourth piece is a lot of what we're going to talk about today. So let's get into that now that my spiel is done. So agenda, past. How do we get here? When we're talking about the legalities and really the legal kind of backdrop to good faith security research and making the internet a safer place, like what's the backstory? The present, where are we up to? I'll talk about some data that we've gathered out of the Disclose.io project and a few other things, and just talk about kind of the current state of conversation around legal frameworks and so on. And then the future, how do we improve? What I'm going to do at that section of the talk is actually talk you all through the Disclose.io project itself, which is something that I will not preempt right now, but that's basically something that I know OWASP has an incredible and a rich history of basically turning security into a team sport. Disclose.io is an open source project, and hopefully this will encourage a bunch of you to either adopt what's going on there or actually contribute and help out. So let's do that. All right, how did we get here? What is the CFAA? It's an interesting one. I've got I had the hackers backdrop before I changed it to usual suspects because it didn't quite fit into the frame, but as we're recording this, it's the 25th anniversary of the Hackers movie. This is another, hacker classic, War Games. The interesting thing about this movie is that Ronald Reagan actually saw it at Camp David, basically kind of freaked out and went back and spoke to the DOJ, and a whole bunch of anti-hacking law was the product of that. So the CFAA that we deal with today was really the product of Hollywood. Thanks, guys. And honestly, at the time, it was actually, I think, a fairly appropriate measure because the internet back then doesn't look anything like what it looks today. So really, that's kind of, the backstory of how that law came to pass. And, the challenge with it is that there's been some evolution of the law itself over the past, where are we up to now, 35 years, but not a whole lot. And what we've seen, alongside that is this incredible acceleration of the engagement of good faith security research as a part of the internet's immune system and the way that it keeps itself safe and understands where its issues are so they can be fixed, all of that good stuff. The law is basically trailing behind that. So what do we do about that, which is kind of what we're going to go through today. So in terms of backstory, I'm just having some trouble advancing the slides here. So in terms of backstory around bug bounties and vulnerability disclosure, in 1995, Netscape launched the Bugs Bounty program. They dropped the S later because it's cleaner. And yes, that was a social network joke for those who missed it. There's been the idea of basically putting rewards out for people to test security systems. It's been around for centuries. People used to do it with locks prior to the internet and the technology industry showing up. But Netscape's broadly accepted as the first technology bug bounty as we know them today, right? In 2008, Google and Facebook started off their programs, and really that was when there started to be a bunch of noise generated around this idea that kind of broke out of almost the echo chamber of vulnerability research prior to that point in time. At that point, the rest of the security industry started to sit up and take notice, and some people in technology outside of security started to understand what was going on as well. Really, that's where kind of I got involved in this stuff from a commercial and a career standpoint. Having been involved with the hacker community for a long time prior to that, seeing the intrigue, frankly, that organizations were kind of showing around this idea of just being able to access the talent, the entire talent the internet has available to be able to help make them more secure. And this idea of if we're trying to outsmart an army of adversaries, then having access to an army of allies makes sense. So bada bing, bada boom, you've got Bug Crowd. And about a year into that, we noticed a couple of things that were pretty interesting. As we're basically trying to make vulnerability disclosure and bug bounty programs easy and connect these two very different groups of people to have a productive conversation. There's this centerpiece of that whole kind of interaction that is the program brief and the legal language that exists within the program brief. And we noticed a couple of things. It was, the first, I think, was the fact that the legal teams that the companies that we worked with at that point in time, this is still true today, aren't used to the idea of inviting hackers to come in and poke around their stuff. We've got 30 years of technology law that's basically focused around the idea of saying no, go away. And now we're trying to find ways to say, hey, if you're helpful, that's okay. How do we do that? So the legal teams in general just weren't quite sure how to approach this whole thing. And lawyers have a tendency when they're uncertain to basically trend towards verbosity. They'll write War and Peace, and that's their job. They're actually doing the right thing from a legal standpoint. But the problem that creates is that the hackers on the other side that are trying to read and interpret these briefs, half of them are English as a second language. Not very many of them have a legal background. There's basically almost like the EULA problem that you have with, iTunes or installing an application on your computer. Like you should read it. Ideally, everyone would read every EULA before they accept it. But the reality is that people tend not to. They'll either gloss over it or completely ignore it, right? And we saw a similar thing happening with what we were doing. This is a problem because, the whole idea around the CFAA is that if you're, we'll get into this in a second, if you're touching a computer or if you're interacting with a computer in a way that you haven't been authorized to do, it's potentially a felony crime in the United States. And the thing about that, this is not just about the CFAA, it's actually about equivalent anti-hacking laws that exist all around the world. So, okay, that's not great. What is the CFAA? It basically prohibits behaviors that exceed authorized access to a protected computer or the accessing of a protected computer without authorized access. So you're either exceeding or you're touching something that you just haven't been told you can touch in the first place. The challenge with the way that this law has been written and the way that it's phrased is that protected computer is incredibly broad. It was actually intended at the time to cover government systems. But the way it was written, it was anything that's communicating across state lines or internationally, which is pretty much every computer that's on the internet right now. So it brings everything into scope that's someone else's computer or that has the ability to connect to the internet. And why I call that out is it is different from laws like the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, where it's more about the software that you can actually hold in your hands. That's more relevant to things like IoT and so on. So, okay, there's that. And then this whole idea of authorized access. Well, if I'm doing security testing, exceeding authorized access is probably one of my goals. So how do you make that safer for the people that are actually trying to do that in good faith and actually try to help make things more secure, not act as an adversary in doing all of that? And I think the challenge with the CFAA, since it was instantiated, is that it really is being used. What we've seen and what we've heard from people like the EFF and the Department of Justice and so on is that when it comes to actual prosecutions that make it in front of a judge and jury, the CFAA tends to be used correctly. There are examples even recently of 1030s that have been prosecuted. They do tend to be folks that, in context of the conversation we're having right now, it's not a security researcher that's, kind of stumbled into something that they've then been pursued for. It's usually actual, criminal behavior or things that, are alleged to be criminal behavior. The challenge is that it really does create this chilling effect around security research. I'll give some examples of how that plays out shortly. It's less about whether you actually get, banned and the books thrown at you from a legal standpoint. It's more around the fact that that's possible. That's the thing that is chilling and has been chilling to security researchers for a very long time. And there has been plenty of examples where the CFAA has been used. I'll give a few of those in a moment. So, we're thinking about all of this stuff as BugCrowd, trying to grow as an organization, trying to basically change the perception of hackers from just being, burglars to also, potentially being locksmiths in the eyes of the industry. And that part, I think, has actually been quite successful. At this point in time, hackers, there's still a stigma and work to be done there. But we've gone from being the default bad guy to being potentially helpful, which I think is actually pretty cool. But really, we were looking at all of that and we started asking ourselves, how do we make it easy to do this well? Like if we're trying to create briefs that are legally complete, that address both sides, that are easy to understand, how can we make this easy to do well? So in 2014, we released the Open Source Vulnerability Disclosure Framework in collaboration with CypherLaw out of DC. At the same time, the ISO standards were being released, so there was a few people kind of triangulating all on the same problem, which was awesome. Between 2014 and 2017, what we saw was the OSVDF being basically copy pasted and translated into different languages. And that original language is kind of everywhere now at this point, which is really how this works. What we observed was the idea of like prior art and copy pasta, legal templating and boilerplating was fairly common. It was something that legal teams and people trying to stand up these programs were actually doing to make those things work. So that was an interesting data point. In 2018, Amit In 2018, Amit El-Azhari started hitting the talk circuit, talking about safe harbor. Dropbox launched their safe harbor clauses in their program, and really what we started to do in context of BugCrowd and the OSVDF was collaborate with all of those folk and try to figure out how we can, like, how do we blow this up? How do we make it easy to do this well? How do we do that together, right? In 2018, we decided, okay, it's time that we actually spun this out into its own project, its own brand, its own potential organization. We're actually pursuing 501c3 for Disclose.io right now. And we basically, took our project, legal bug bounty, and a few other things and brought them all together into the Disclose.io project itself. And in 2019, BugCrowd started adding this language to programs by default. We've seen it adopted elsewhere as well. So, going back to this chilling effect, like 60% of good faith hackers don't submit vulnerabilities for fear of legal retribution. So these are people that haven't necessarily been prosecuted or even necessarily arrested. They've just had negative interactions with organizations, or they've heard of others that have had those sorts of interactions, and they're not submitting vulnerabilities. They're not actually participating in their capacity to make the internet a safer place because this law is so ambiguous. If you're a good person doing things that just kind of wander a little bit off into territory that could be considered a bad thing, and you end up working with a company that's having a bad day, that's not a good thing. So this is a problem that we need to solve. An example of where this actually happened practically, Kevin Finisterre's phenomenal guy, knows all sorts of incredible things about the security of drones, and he did a fair bit of work on the DJI bug bounty program. And when I say a fair bit of work, some of the vulnerabilities that Kevin started to identify and pass across to DJI started to make them a little bit concerned. So they were unhappy and basically trying to chill and control the security research that Kevin was doing. I'll make these slides available so you can actually read this letter. It's quite a read. It's actually very threatening. It's talking about all sorts of legal action coming from all sorts of different places, including, the use of the CFAA in a federal context, basically accusing Kevin of a felony crime. None of that stuff should have happened in the first place. Like the fact that they'd gone out and actually put together a bounty brief and got it out there and invited this input would have suggested that this is probably not something that's going to happen. It happened anyway. So again, the question becomes, how do we make it easy to do this well and avoid situations like this? Avoid chilling the input of people like Kevin into making the internet a safer place. So that's backstory. The present, in terms of where we're up to, I think the thing that really drives a lot of acceptance in a way that rolls up into the reformation of laws, it goes to adoption. It's like how, I mentioned just before how, hackers have gone from being the kind of the boogeyman to being, potentially helpful, to being even invited and celebrated by all sorts of different parts of the internet, which is a fantastic thing. We've seen a bunch of other stuff in terms of the adoption of, this whole kind of core concept of vulnerability disclosure and actually inviting input from the outside world, which is what I'm going to go into in this section. As a part of Disclose.io, we have a tool set called we call it DIOSTS. We haven't figured out if we should acronym it or just use it as a word, but DIOSTS will do for now. What that's doing is actually going out, you basically feed it. It's a Go script that you feed input, and it goes out and checks for the presence of a security.txt file, passes that file, dumps out the format into JSON that's compatible with some other components of Disclose.io that I'll get to shortly. And it's pretty interesting what we've seen it spitting out. Like within the top 100,000 websites on, according to Alexa, there's 933 of them in total. So that's like less than 1% that have a security text file in place in the first place. And of those 933 programs, only about 50% of them have a policy. That's important because without a policy, all you're really doing is establishing a communication channel. Like from Bugcrowd's perspective, and I think this is a broadly accepted, kind of definition of a vulnerability disclosure program at this point, you can have an intake channel, but without a policy, no one knows what's okay and what's not okay. So you have to have those two things together. And you can kind of see, 1% in the top 100,000 is actually indicative, I think, of the fact that, companies that are popular on the internet tend to be more progressive and more understanding of these types of things. And that's frankly, our theory for why that's higher than it is for the 1 million, which is where it's less than 0.1%. And in the 10 million, it's half a tenth of a percent. So, it's one of these areas where we're seeing, people use these tools and get these things out there in a way that makes, vulnerability disclosure programs and the ability to actually, submit issues to them identifiable to the internet, and not just the security community, but the internet at large. But there's still a pretty long way to go. Another data point that we've got is through the Disclose.io list. This is actually a tweet that goes out fairly regularly from the Disclose.io Twitter. And what we're doing there is essentially enumerating the safe harbor status, which I'll get to shortly, on all of the different programs that we've actually got logged within our database at this point in time. So, 973 programs, 141 of them, 14.5% with what we consider to be full authorization, 21.5% with partial, and so on. So, again, there's progress. What we've seen with this number is it's gone up, fairly steadily over time. And it continues to do that. Really what we'd like to see is for it to do that faster. With respect to the CFAA itself, there's some pretty interesting stuff going on. The Van Buren case, which is actually currently up in front of the Supreme Court, is an interesting read. There's some stuff that happened that, essentially, I won't go into that side of it, but really what it's done is actually brought the CFAA into question in terms of how it's interpreted. And that has the ability or the potential to set precedent for how it's used in the future. So that got a lot of attention from us, from the Electronic Frontiers Foundation, from the Center for Democracy and Technology, and so on. We put together what's called an amicus brief, which is essentially a Friends of the Court brief, where we go in and say, okay, here's what you're trying to figure out with how you're interpreting the CFAA. Like, this is a component of that decision that you probably should consider. And that particular brief really does go through, the role of security researchers on the internet, the fact that CFAA has been chilling to a lot of good work, and that it continues to be so, and the fact that it should be narrowed in its definition to make it more focused on actual bad faith actors and not catch good faith actors in its kind of definition and covering. So that was a pretty exciting thing. Unfortunately, we had a vendor by the name of Votes who are trying to put elections on the blockchain, basically write a brief saying, no, you can't tell the difference between someone who's conducting security research in good faith versus someone who's doing that in bad faith. The CFAA should be broadened to basically have it hinge on authorization. So only people that have been authorized to do security testing in any circumstance should be allowed to do that. Otherwise, it's illegal, which clearly I don't agree with, nor did about 70 other security researchers, organizations, some Congress people, and others that responded on this letter here. So, I think just as a practical piece, like, this is the kind of thing that's ongoing right now. Like, as this goes to air, this conversation around Van Buren is actually going to be progressed. So, reading up on it, understanding, what your own viewpoint is, like forming that viewpoint, understanding what that is, but then, doing whatever you need to with it. It's an election year. There's all sorts of different ways that I think the input of experts that understand this type of thing can be brought to bear in order to get a good outcome for security research and for the safety of the internet itself. As well as that, we had signatories. Again, by the time this goes to air, we're going to have the ability for others to actually sign on and basically agree with the letter, from a petitioning standpoint. So that's another thing that you can do as a call to action. All right, so cool. This is sort of where it's up to. Going back to the backstory piece of the presentation, really where we got to thinking as we started Disclose.io and as that's progressed is, how do we make the adoption of vulnerability disclosure with best practice? So not just have organizations accept the input of security research and actually invite that, but to have them do that well, like have them extend things like, authorization against CFAA and so on. How do we make that go viral? And that brings me to the next section of this talk. I'm keeping an eye on time here. So how do we improve? And this is where I'm going to introduce Disclose.io itself as a project. So really the vision of Disclose.io is a healthy and a ubiquitous internet immune system. Our view, and I think the view of most folk that work in this kind of aspect of vulnerability management that involves the security research community, is that security researchers are kind of like the internet's immune system. Like we run around, we find things that need to be fixed or need to be addressed. We work on those things, and kind of the problem that the internet has right now is almost equivalent to an autoimmune deficiency or disease. Like there's a rejection of that help that consistently goes on. And ultimately that means that everything is less resilient, less safe, less healthy. And we want to solve that. Credit to Karen Elizari for the internet immune system analogy. She did a fantastic TED talk probably about 6 or 7 years ago now that actually established that analogy, and I think it's perfect. So really the way or the mission of Disclose.io is to drive vulnerability disclosure adoption through safety, simplicity, and standardization. And I will say again, like this started out of BugCrowd. At this point in time, there's all sorts of different folks that are contributing to it. It's an open source project that we've actually worked pretty hard to make agnostic to BugCrowd as an organization. Like BugCrowd benefits from this type of thing because if the internet's more accepting of security research, everything we do becomes that little bit easier. But really the design goal of Disclose.io is for it to actually function independent and above what we're doing as an organization at BugCrowd. So just to call that out. All right, so what are the components of Disclose.io? There's the terms that we've put together. And really what they are, they're boilerplates. It's really this idea of, being able to, going back to the explanation I gave at the start around the OSVDF, how can we have like good copy pasta on bug bounty boilerplate briefs that are actually going to be useful. So it's not something that is like a checkbox and you're done. It's useful from a legal standpoint. It's useful from a readability standpoint. And it's easy to access for all sorts of different organizations. We've seen people just copy paste it. We've seen people use it as a foundation for their own framework. We've seen people use it as a starting point for their own versions, all of which is stuff that we want to see continue. That was like literally the stated goal. And on the right here, just to be clear to call out, these aren't endorsements of the project from the organizations themselves. The reason that these logos are up here, it's the kind of organizations that the people that are contributing to this project are coming from. So it's not just Casey the Bush lawyer and a bunch of other folk from the hacker community doing this. We're actually bringing in and actually frankly fielding interest from the kinds of people that can really do this well, from all sorts of different parts of the internet, all sorts of different organizations, government, and so on. So that part's pretty exciting. When we're putting together the terms, I touched on this before. It's kind of hard, to be honest, because what we have to do is balance this idea of legal completeness against some of these kind of overarching laws that are very vague and require a fair bit of clarification. How do you make that clarity as complete as possible, whilst keeping it readable and brief, and also whilst maintaining the safety of the organization as well as the hacker. So as a company that's trying to launch a VDP and that wants to do that well, what you don't want to do is put legal terminology out there that says, hey, everyone can come and do whatever they want, and I forfeit my right to any recourse for an actual bad faith actor. Like, that would be a bad outcome. So how can you balance that out to make sure that you're protecting people that are operating in good faith while still maintaining your recourse towards those that might be attacking you for real? It's pretty interesting. Like, we've put a lot of work into this. The biggest challenge, and I think a call for participation and help from the OWASP community from an open source standpoint, is actually around translation and making sure that the legal terms communicate across language barriers. More than half, I would say, of the hackers that participate in these types of things that would actually need to read and understand this type of thing, they're not necessarily thinking or speaking in English as their first language. So there's an element of translation that's already in play, and we've tried to be mindful of things like that and how we put this these terms together. So it's a good thing. And really, what we're doing is we're extending it out into different regions, different geographies. We actually wrote a version that's been adopted or used as a foundational template by the state of Ohio and ES&S and some of the other voting machine manufacturers as well around election security. I can tell you that writing a vulnerability disclosure program brief for an election system set within a state, that's a pretty interesting thing to do, because it's quite a diverse attack surface and there's a lot of players involved. So it's those sorts of problems that we're trying to solve with these boilerplates that we're putting together. And again, from an open source contribution standpoint, submitting PRs, if there's local language translation that you feel you can do, if there's local knowledge of laws outside of the US, outside of, at the moment, there's Canada, the US, and the Netherlands covered. And we'd love to see more countries in there. So if you've got, local legal or local language knowledge of a jurisdiction and would like to actually translate the terms, please submit a PR or get in touch. That would be fantastic. Yeah. All right, next up, in terms of what we're doing, there's the list. So the list is really, it's a community-powered vendor agnostic directory of all known VDPs and bug bounty programs. It's essentially a big JSON blob that sits on GitHub. And really the idea of it is for it to be as broadly contributed to and broadly consumable as possible. We don't want to make it proprietary or kind of focused or tilted it in any particular direction. We just want this active, kind of true directory of all of the different places that you could potentially go off and do proactive security research if that's what you're looking for, or if you're looking for someone to actually submit an issue once you found one. This can serve that purpose as well. It's up there in JSON and CSV. Probably the big call out with the terms and with the list is that they're both licensed under CCA 4.0. So it's open source. It's free for reuse, for repurposing with attribution. So that's kind of the spirit of how we've put all of that together. I think the piece that I get excited about is this one. This is the seal. And really where we'd love to, the people that are working on this project and myself would love to see this get to, is the idea of the seal almost becoming like the green padlock of vulnerability disclosure and the right kind of like legalities and channels and frameworks being put in place behind that. And I use the green padlock deliberately, knowing full well that that's in the process of being phased out. Like, I would love to see that happen, for this to be a thing where vulnerability disclosure programs and the acceptance and understanding of good faith security research is so ubiquitous across the internet, you just don't even need to say it anymore. Like that would be a fantastic goal. I think a fantastic win for everyone. We're not there yet, so this is what we're doing next. So how we've broken out the seal at this point in time is basically a good faith statement, which is sometimes referred to as partial safe harbor, and then a explicit authorization, which is sometimes referred to as full safe harbor. Those two things are really important in terms of the difference. Partial safe harbor or a good faith statement is essentially when you read a vulnerability disclosure policy and it says words to the effect of, if you're not a jerk, we won't lawyer up. It's better than nothing. And if you go back to the tweet that I posted just before, it's actually in the minority. The number of vulnerability disclosure program policies that have even a basic good faith statement is actually not the majority of the ones that are out there. So you're doing better than a program that doesn't have one if you've got something like this. The challenge to it is that it isn't providing authorization. Like under the problem with this is that it's not actually providing explicit authorization, which is kind of the linchpin term of CFAA. So theoretically, and if you go back to the DJI case with Kevin, this is pretty much what happened there. If there's vulnerability submitted, or if there's security research that's done that's as a organization you don't necessarily like, you can turn back around and say, hey, that was unauthorized, and all of a sudden you kind of back to square one. So I think the risk of that happening with a good faith statement is lower than if one doesn't exist at all, but it's still incomplete. So that's where full safe harbor or explicit authorization kicks in. And really what the deal is there is that you've got legal language, which obviously is in the templates that I just mentioned. You got legal language that explicitly authorizes good faith security research in context of any hacking laws like the CFAA, but it also provides exemption for any circumvention laws, which are things like the DMCA, for example. Making sure that if you're doing security research and bypassing circumvention controls in a way that could trigger something like DMCA, there's an exemption from that. There's also an exemption under the acceptable use policy or terms of service, which is kind of in the spirit of what Aaron's law was trying to basically achieve. The whole idea there is that if you violate the terms of service in the way that you're interacting with a computer system or a service, does that then constitute unauthorized access that kind of brings you into scope for prosecution under CFAA? So there's an exemption for that. And then just a general acknowledgement of good faith. It's really kind of almost this idea of, hey, like, we believe that you're trying to do a good thing. So let's make sure that that's stated and clear. If you got those things, then yep, that's full safe harbor. Or that's explicit authorization in terms of the Disclose.io seal. And at that point, organizations that have met kind of the burden of proof, or the burden of compliance to either of these two things, they can then display that seal, which is when it starts to get interesting, which is what I'm going to get to in the next slide. So this is where it starts to go viral, and this harks back to the whole the picky in the brain slide earlier on. How do we get it to the point where it's not conversations like this one, where people like myself and others in the space are trying to convince program owners that doing this well is a good thing? Like, how do we just make that something that is a draw, it's a pull rather than a push? And really, this is how we're looking at it, and this is how we're actually trying to get this done with Disclose.io. An organization launches a vulnerability disclosure program, they're added to the list either because they do it themselves, or because a hacker or a security researcher, or someone who works on Disclose.io adds them to that list. If they don't have a good faith statement or explicit authorization at that point, they'll notice that because they'll come up with a, yep, no, you don't have that. At which point, the organization is going to go back to the repo and see this opportunity for them to add terms that are going to make their vulnerability disclosure briefs safer. At that point, safe harbor is granted, or the seal rather is actually granted to them. They display it, and a couple of interesting things happen at that point. Their customers see it. The beauty of vulnerability disclosure programs, I think, compared with a lot of other security controls that we have, is that your grandma or your grandpa can understand it. It's something that's accessible as an idea to a non-technical person, because it's basically neighborhood watch for the internet. So as an organization, if you've got the neighborhood watch sign on the front of your website, all of a sudden your customers are feeling more confident and comfortable in your product as they're rocking up and making a decision whether to buy or not. So business improves. That's good, right? Then hackers see it and realize that this is an organization that's been proactive about making me feel welcome as I'm trying to help them out. So security improves, which is good. The part that I get really excited about, and we've seen this in all sorts of different industries throughout the life of Bugcrowd, is that peer pressure starts to kick in. So the idea of, there being like 3 banks, 2 of them are running vulnerability disclosure programs with safe harbor, the 3rd one isn't. All of a sudden, that 3rd one is starting to look a little behind the times, and they'll correct and actually work to catch up to be in parity from a best practice standpoint with their peers. And honestly, I think that's the thing that we need to trigger, getting it to the point where, like vulnerability disclosure and interaction with security researchers isn't the thing that crazy Bay Area companies do anymore, or people that are, technically aggressive and progressive in how they're approaching security. It's just something that is a normal part of being on the internet. And frankly, you're kind of weird if you don't do. That's, what we can kind of trigger with this network effect. And, given, again, the unprecedented times, it feels a little too soon to be talking about in terms of, viral marketing and network effect. But really, that's kind of what this is about. How do we increase the R naught of doing it right? So that's the goal of this project. In terms of how the folks that are watching this and participating can be a part of it, start a vulnerability disclosure program if you're in a position to do that within your organization. Don't go off half-cocked and just do it. It's something that you need to actually think about and plan out, but like get on that train. I think, interaction with security researchers is something that everyone who is in the security industry is going to need to figure out how to do at some point in their career. So the choice right now is to be proactive about that, or to wait until you need to be reactive with that. And I think proactive is probably a better choice. If you're already running a vulnerability disclosure program, or if you're launching one, add those clauses, like make sure that there is either good faith or ideally explicit authorization clauses in your brief, and join Disclose.io, like display the seal proudly. Get to the point where you're not only making hackers feel comfortable, but you're driving best practice in your industry, and you're actually signaling back up to legislators and people that are, considering whether or not it's time to reform the CFAA. You're giving them something to look at in terms of, the groundswell support for that idea. That's something that we can all be a part of as a team sport. Contributing to the project, we're at github.com/disclose. Hello at Disclose.io. All of those contributions, there's a bunch of stuff that we've got already kind of working that really relies on constant community input and contribution. So being a part of that would be much appreciated. There's a bunch of tooling that we're wanting to work on as well. You saw the security.txt scanner. There's other variations of that we're working on putting together to actually map out the internet. So folks that particularly can program in Golang and can work with others in an open source tooling capacity, we'd love to hear from you and to be able to work together on that as well. And then spread the word. I think, again, the idea of this movement is to basically make vulnerability disclosure normal. I think of the I mentioned earlier on that BugCrowd was the first platform to market. There's at last count 40 or 42, I believe, similar to BugCrowd platforms that exist all around the world at this point. That's fantastic. Like, honestly, this is bigger than that. I think it's actually making sure that the immune system of the internet can function properly. And I think that's something that we can all get behind. So to sum up, the CFAA and other anti-hacking laws do continue to chill good faith security research. We're seeing evidence of that. We're seeing things that go wrong, even as recently as this week, as we record this talk. But there's been enormous progress over the last 8 years. In spite of that, there's still a long way to go, but things are trending in the right direction. So, let's all do our part. And thank you very much for attending my talk. Again, many thanks to the OWASP crew, Vanderaj and all of those folks. Really appreciate the opportunity to connect. I am on Twitter at Casey John Ellis. Would love to connect with anyone with questions or follow up from this, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.